Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this webinar. My name is Emily Hough, and I'm founder and editor-in-chief of the Crisis Response Journal. And we're absolutely delighted to be working with the Emergency Show and the International Disaster Management Exhibition, which are part of the World Humanitarian Forum's portfolio. And the aim of these platforms is to bring decision makers and opinion formers in the public, private, and non-profit sectors together. And these annual exhibitions and conferences are designed to enable global discussions and transform conversations into action. And this is why I'm particularly pleased on behalf of CRJ to be working together on a series of webinars and other similar ventures, which aim to encourage a cross-sector and multidisciplinary dialogue, along with purposeful partnerships and inclusive networks to enable the international community to connect and shape the future for a better tomorrow. And today is the start of the conversation. We will be widening it over future events. Today's theme is multi-agency emergency management response. Where do we go from here? And by way of background, the Global Health Security Index of 2019 placed the UK second in terms of its preparedness to handle epidemics or pandemics, and it was placed just behind the USA. Yet by any metric, the UK has been hit extremely hard by COVID-19, both in terms of the awful death toll and the extreme economic contraction. Now, concerns are that we are in the eye of the COVID-19 hurricane, so we have a brief respite before the storm comes back, possibly with even greater force. So this is the time we should be regrouping and refocusing and working out what will the next 12 months look like, because we don't have the traditional luxury of deep analysis and reflection over a period of time once this crisis has ended. COVID-19 is calling for a more dynamic learning process on the Hough. And there are other disruptive events that are brewing, many of which we know about. We have Brexit, impending deepening economic issues, what seems to be now regular winter flooding, the flu season, not to mention the wild cards such as civil unrest, societal disruption, and who knows what else. So we've got to be honest and examine the response so far to see where we can improve. And I'd emphasize that nobody is questioning the dedication and the talent and the skill of everyone who's been involved in this response so far. But there are questions, and there's a massive knot we have to unpick. And I'm hoping we can tease out some initial strands. So with that in mind, we're going to take an initial look at a couple of important areas through the lens of multi-agency working, as they relate to the public experience and services provided to the public, trust, communication, human factors, and the future. And I'm really pleased that we've got three excellent panelists today who are joining us. We have Louise Davidson, who's a PhD student at the University of Sussex. And Louise is part of a research group that's been carrying out some fascinating research in terms of understanding the challenges that have been faced by local resilience forums during the COVID-19 response. We also have David Wales, who after a long career in the Fire and Rescue Service in the UK, has developed a deep engagement with and passion for putting the customer at the heart of emergency services design. And we also have Jacqui Semple, who's chair of the Emergency Planning Society. She'll be providing an insight into the concerns, thoughts, and responses from the UK's planning community. So the format is that each panelist will talk for a few minutes, then we'll address some general questions, as well as questions posed by attendees of this webinar, before each panelist then does a short summary. And this webinar is planned to last for 1 hour. So with no further ado, I'll hand over to Louise, if you could start, please.
Hello, my name is Louise Davidson, and as Emily said, I am a PhD student at the University of Sussex, working with Dr. Holly Carter and Professor Richard Amlow from Public Health England, Professor John Drury from the University of Sussex, and Professor Alex Haslam from the University of Queensland. And my research is focused on multi-agency response to major incidents, and I'm looking at applying social psychology principles to understand more about the way in which emergency responders come together, both within their own organisation and between different organisations to work towards a collective goal. And most recently, my research has been focused on the COVID-19 response, and I've been interviewing responders from across the United Kingdom at the strategic and tactical response levels to understand any challenges they have been facing and how these relate to multi-agency working. And based on this, I've been producing reports of my findings, which can be found online at Crisis Response Journal. And in these reports, I highlight some recommendations and suggestions of what works in the multi-agency response to COVID-19 to support the ongoing development of good working practice. And my goal in these reports was to produce practical suggestions that can be implemented at the local level. And I currently have 2 reports which have been completed and a third which is currently in draft form. And suggestions that I've included in these reports include providing new partners in the local response to COVID-19 with a full briefing of the purpose of the Local Resilience Forum and the structure of the meetings they will be attending, to enable any new partners that might come around the table who perhaps aren't as familiar with the structure to be able to quickly integrate into the group. Another suggestion is forming regional connections with other local resilience forums to be able to share and discuss ideas and lessons and learn from each other. And another suggestion is an emphasis for the chair of strategic and tactical coordination groups to continue to emphasize the shared goal of the response in every meeting to help embed that sense of usness and that team sense in the group. So that's a quick overview of my research so far.
Thank you very much. And as you mentioned, the first 2 reports are available on CRJ, and I would on the CRJ website, and I would really urge people to read them. But I personally found them very, very interesting indeed, especially in terms of communication, which is something that we're going to be looking at later on during the questions and answers as well. So if we can turn to David, please.
Thank you, Emily, and it's great to be part of the panel today. Thank you very much for the invitation. As you say, my name's David Wells, and I'm the founder of a company called Shared Aim, and we focus on the human side of customer experience and organisational improvement. In a world where the technology, process, and methodologies sometimes dominate, we forget that it's the human factors that has to play such a crucial part. And we often look to the process to understand why something's gone wrong, when actually it can be explained in a very different way. So we're very interested in how things actually work, if you like, the as is rather than the believed scenario. The way I came to setting up the company last year was from, as you mentioned, a career in the fire service. And it struck me, it was over 20 years before I had any meaningful conversation with our customers. And it was because we wanted to understand why people were getting injured in dwelling fires. And so we asked the question, why don't the public just do as they're told, or as we advise them to? If only they would do as we requested, we felt everything would be okay. And so that search took us initially to interview 10 people that had small fires and small injuries. And by the 3rd interview, I had to really step back from what I believed I understood about fire. At that point, I thought I understood it as a firefighter, a fire officer, and a fire investigator. But hearing the customers describe in their words the experience made me understand just how different it was from them than it was for me, and how we'd never incorporated that view into our planning. And really, for me, that was a key part of the company. Not to say that the fire service is right, the public are wrong, or vice versa, but to respect that there are multiple views of the same event. And the trick is to understand and hear those and mesh them together. And very briefly, a quick story that really cemented that for me was a lady interviewed spoke about her son who'd been at home on his own for a fire. It was only a small fire, didn't come into the property, but he was scared that the fire would happen again and that he didn't do the right thing. And this was about 9 months after the event. And she said, it'd been helpful if you could have sent somebody down to talk to him. And I said, I can do that. She said, well, it's too late now. And so the reality is a fire that we wouldn't have thought twice about, that was actually very, very small in size, was haunting this family for a long period. Possibly the sights and smells of it would haunt him for life. If only we'd actually taken the time to speak to her and hear what she wanted us to deliver. We had the resources available. It was no extra inconvenience. We could have gone from somebody who will be haunted for life about that fear, and it affects every day, to somebody who we could have reassured did the right thing and gone to school as our ambassador and actually been a great peer advocate amongst a difficult to reach group. And so it's those really little simple things that if you don't listen and hear the customer, we do our job, we put the fire out, we went away satisfied. We missed the impact that it had. And just following on from that work, which is again published and available to people, the human behaviour research, we did a piece of work looking at the burn survivors' experience. And from their perspective and using the available evidence, we realised that the way the agencies come together delivered a sum of the parts. The only person that saw end to end was the casualty. And the reality is that because there weren't the same principles, there wasn't the same understanding, and nobody was talking to each other, they got a real mismatch. And unfortunately, there are people that have got injuries that could have been avoided had we worked in things in a different way. And again, that report's available. And two of the lessons learned were really about the need for an overarching framework that talks about customer experience in the public sector, and particularly emergency services, and the need to change the way we do approach partnerships. But I think we'll cover some of that during the session today anyway. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. I think we will, and that's a really poignant point, that the only person who sees end to end of an incident is the casualty. And I'll be interested later to possibly explore how we sort of frame that within the COVID-19 experience as well. And as you correctly say, there will be discussions on that area. So thank you very much. Jacqui, can we turn to you, please?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. When I was thinking about what I was going to cover for 3 minutes this afternoon, it started to get me thinking about all of the questions that are currently being asked, but how long have we been asking them? So I wanted to very quickly go over a paper that I did probably 2 or 3 years ago now, and I've also brought it up to date, and I thought I would share it with you. Hot off the press, actually, this morning I was on another webinar and had a great phrase from Professor David Alexander at University College in London, who talked about, please don't rearrange the deck chairs on the Titanic. And it made me think, how often do we change what we do? Or do we call it something different? Do we just rearrange, but actually it doesn't really change the outcome? So we know that the operating landscape for emergency management has changed extensively. Particularly in the UK, we had the introduction of legislation and the implementation of the Civil Contingencies Act. That was pretty groundbreaking at the time and provided the statutory duties and regulations for the delivery of emergency management within the UK. It also built upon the principles of integrated emergency management. However, we live in a world that's complex, interdependent, dynamic risks, and we have an increase in the range of threats and hazards. None more so than now than what we're dealing with the global pandemic. A lot of what we do is driven by societal change, globalisation, reform, changes at local and national structures, but also political activity. We also need to think about the impact and consequences of emergencies at home and abroad. We're a small world where global changes impact all of us on what we do and how we do it. Therefore, I think we really need to have a real thought process around where are we going now? We must consider new horizons to shape and influence the direction of the profession. That means defining, underpinning the body of knowledge that we have through professional practice, education, competence, standards, research, and the production of an integrated learning landscape that provides a pathway to have trained, skilled, and competent people, ultimately that we're all fit to practice. If we look at recommendations from recent incidents and even the recent reports that have come out on how we've responded to the global pandemic, what it tells us and reminds us is that we deal with a range of emergencies that evolve every day, with challenges that we face every day. Therefore, our competence has never been more to the fore and under scrutiny than it is now. I think the other thing I would say is that our multi-agency and learning landscape is absolutely multifarious, with national occupational standards, professional competence, resilience standards, joint emergency interoperability principles, to name but a few, and of course the wide range of doctrine and guidance. Academically, there are lots of universities that are delivering lots across the curriculum along with colleges. The Emergency Planning Society has undertaken work recently on the production of a new academic database to look at what courses are out there. In addition, we also have many students who are members with us, similar to Louise, in terms of the work that they're doing. They're the future. We need to think about what can they bring to us and understand where we are. So in terms of the complexities, and despite best endeavours, for all of us, no matter what sector we're in, to join the dots. The big gaps remain evident, and I think more so, more than ever, they remain evident. The roles of a professional association, the government, learning, training establishments, academia, partnerships and research are absolutely critical in terms of how we shape and coordinate differently. If you think about the methodology of a three horizons approach, this perhaps simplifies the questions that I think we need to ask. Those are, what is occurring more widely within our resilience landscape that is resulting in changes, and also within our practice of resilience? What examples of a new future do we already have in the present? So what things have worked really well and would we want to keep? But also, what do we need to change, and the acceptance of the need to change? Never has there been a better opportunity for us to engage and shape our future differently. We have a moment in time to make a difference and change, and that time, I suggest, is now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's absolutely summed up, I think, the thinking behind this webinar and so forth. It's not to say that it would be easy, because I know that while we're not out of this current crisis, and it's, as I alluded to before, at what stage of the crisis are we in when we have to undertake that change? Do you think, and we'll move into the first question actually, is this current slight hiatus the opportunity to regroup and start planning for the future? But equally, do we have to keep one eye permanently on what we're doing and how we need to change? Is that too much to take on in one thing, or do you think that's what we have to do?
I think we absolutely need to be on the ball with this. And, you know, we've heard lots of experts and lots of opinions, and everybody has an opinion. And I think what we need to understand is that we are still responding to the pandemic, whilst we are looking to stabilise and transition into recovery and renewal. And renewal being very ambitious about what we can achieve differently in the future. That said, you mentioned in your opening remarks, Emily, about the concurrent risks that we face, which is the planning ahead for winter flu, alongside COVID-19, and particularly a second wave or local outbreaks. We're seeing that occur in other countries. So we need to think about all of that, but our learning, our identification of what we know has gone well and what we know hasn't, we need to start applying that now. Because if we don't, it's a lost opportunity. And that's not about making the huge changes. That's about reflecting the fact that we know we can do this better. And I think that at a government level, we absolutely need to be heard through the voice and collectively come up with some ideas and solutions for how that might happen. Because I think if I've learned one thing over the years, is that coming up with some ideas based on evidence and research about how we think things can work, or even from other countries where things work really well. And if we take New Zealand, for example, and the work that's been done there around their emergency management framework in Australia as well, then, you know, there's lots of good practice. I think we're selling ourselves short a wee bit, just to conclude, because I think we have absolutely got brilliant UK emergency management structures and doctrine, but we're not harnessing that together enough in the right way, and we need to question why.
Thank you very much, Jacqui. In fact, actually, David, that leads us very, very neatly on to the next question and your research and work. And do you feel that multi-agency cooperation, both during COVID and pre-COVID, has been supported by our current systems and legislative framework, or does more need to be done?
I think, to reflect Jacqui's point, there's some great work being done, and we've seen that in commercial companies as well, where some have really stepped up to the plate and delivered in weeks what would normally take months and years. And I think we're dealing with the emergency, and as I say, there's a lot of things that have gone well. But I think we do have to be mindful that that is, I think, in many ways, people making the system work. And if we were to start again, I suppose there's two questions. How do we make this better? Or if we started in isolation with the problems we experience around pandemics and that, what would we design a response to look like in this era where we've got the fourth industrial revolution, we're seeing much more people-powered movements in health. And I suspect, to be honest, we would actually end up with something very different. Now, the reality is it's very hard to go from a business as usual model, which is so critical to the national well-being, to something completely different. And again, that's a commercial challenge that many organisations find as well. But I do think there are things that can enhance and keep evolving. And I think that has to be the aspiration, that we're constantly evolving. Probably each time we do this process, at least 10% should look different. And I think there are some things there, again, picking up the point made. I don't sense that we're performance or outcome focused enough. There's a lot about the input and the methodology, but not what the purpose is. And then again, there's a wealth of discussions by experts around purpose. But we are a public service, and for me, the voice of the public is not loud enough, and it's not heard enough, and it's not influential enough in understanding the immediate consequences, the longer term consequences, and how people wish to be treated. So I think that bit feels like it's missing to me. And again, it's got to be much more iterative. We've got to be quicker at learning and much more innovative in our style. And I think there's that fail fast where, but actually that's wrong. If we're testing something and if we don't know the answer, that's learning. It's not failing. Failing is more when something goes wrong that shouldn't have done, I think, in some respects. So the speed at which we're learning should be better. And I think in some ways, innovation won't happen. These are very traditional structures and very empirical structures in many respects. And I think we have to design in innovation. So maybe 5–10% of the budget goes to, say, let's get a group of students to look at how they'd approach the problem. Let's give it to a group of different people. How would historians approach the same problem? I think unless we actively do that and feed those results in and stimulate the mind, stimulate the idea that there's always a different option, there's a different way to do things, we constantly try and refine this system, and we'll continue to do that even when it's past its best and the external circumstances have changed so much that it's broken. And I don't think it is broken, but I think the signs are there that it's struggling to cope with a very different world, if that answers the question.
It does, and I particularly like your point about bringing in different voices and different experiences, and that's about the having the cognitive diversity around the table and getting people in from completely different disciplines, well qualified and experts in their own field, just because if you all come from the same background, you're all going to think the same, and that leads into groupthink and the systems and so forth. So
Absolutely.
and again, very, very neatly, from the practical side, from your research, Louise, Jacqui talked about renewal, and did you get a feel that the multi-agency collaboration and communication, that when you were talking to people, was that underpinned by what recovery should look like, what renewal should look like, how we should be approaching this in the future?
I think, based on my conversations with people, I think that from the very beginning of this response, there has always been half an eye on what recovery is going to look like, and the fact that this incident or COVID is so unique in the sense that there's probably not going to be that neat line between response and recovery. It's likely to go back and forth between the two quite a few times, and also times when we're, in the middle ground where we're not in response, we're not in recovery yet, and just continuing that bouncing back and forth. So I think in that sense, I think multi-agency collaboration up until this point, it has been underpinned by a focus on what this new normal recovery situation would look like. And I think, in some ways, this has been reflected in having the recovery group up and running alongside the strategic coordination group in many areas for quite a long time now. And that's probably partly because of those recognised benefits and how well everyone's come together to maintain that multi-agency collaborative working, but also I think as a recognition that there probably will need to be a switch between response and recovery. So I think there definitely has been a focus on how to keep the responsive collaborative systems in place once we move into recovery, so that if or when they are needed again, they can be quickly switched back on and implemented again. And I think as well, moving forwards, kind of about renewal and going past COVID as well, I think that it's been, this kind of research is ongoing at the moment, and I've had such great engagement from responders, and they're already, I get the sense, thinking that even though, even right at the beginning when we were in the heart of the response phase, they were already looking forward and thinking, what can we learn from this and what can we take forward and improve in the future? So I definitely think that there is an eye on what it's going to look like in the future.
Okay, thank you very much. And that sort of ties in with the communication aspects and so forth. And I was reading your reports again earlier on today, and I think communication and understanding have been such a major feature of this crisis. There's vertical and horizontal communication between agencies, communication from and with central government, and communication with the public, businesses and media. And my question is, do the panelists think that enough listening has taken place? And I'll go with Jacqui first, please.
I guess my honest answer is no. And you know me, I like to be honest. I think to wind it back slightly in terms of the communication across all responders, I think David made a really good point about we make that work. And that part of that is about the planning and preparation and having relationships. Some of that is changing because we've got leaner organisations, we don't have the same staff, and the turnover is very different. I think in terms of the wider communication, one of the things within my own day job, local government, that I have said repeatedly that I think we have an opportunity to change the way that we have dialogue with, not talking at, dialogue with our communities that we serve. No matter whether you're in a company, a private company, commercial, we are all customers and citizens. And I think we absolutely have to listen and hear what is being said. So if we're looking to have better communication, better understanding, and you could go back to the warning and informing part, which is about, what we do before, during and after an incident. But at a very basic level, our communication has to change. And I think that we need to understand that. And it's very difficult with a pandemic because it's so fast moving that things are changing day by day, hour by hour. And, to keep people up to date can be difficult, which is why, you're getting government announcements, and probably a lot of us working within the sector are hearing it at the same time as members of the public. And there are reasons for that. It's not right, but there are reasons. So I do think that we absolutely need to think differently. Our communities have stood up fairly well throughout the pandemic. They've come together. They have complied fairly well up to now. If we're going into a different scenario as we go forward, will we have that same compliance? I think the challenges are there, but it's about getting people to stay on board with you and being honest, and then gaining the trust, which is the other thing. And sometimes politicians putting out those messages are not the best people to do that because of politics and the lack of trust sometimes that can be seen. And sometimes, but I think we need to think about who gives those messages out.
Yes, I think the issue of trust is massive, and how things become weaponized and politicized and so forth. Louise, what do you think about this?
I think coming from an operational point of view of my conversations with the responders that I've been speaking to, initially a key challenge that was highlighted by, I think, nearly every single responder that I spoke to was centered on communication between national and local bodies, where responders were describing to me the frustrations that they felt, as Jacqui just mentioned, in receiving those key messages at the same time as members of the public. So when we went into lockdown and only being able to leave the house for essential reasons, that's obviously got a pretty big operational impact on our local responders. And one responder described to me that he felt that they were constantly behind the curve, constantly playing catch up, putting them at an operational disadvantage and interfering with their ability to provide a timely response. And in terms of listening, I don't think I can comment on whether or not the government have or haven't listened to local feedback. because I haven't spoken to anyone from the national government, and as Jacqui said, there's processes and reasons why things are happening, which I don't know. But what I do know is, based on my conversations with these local responders, they're now seeming to have adapted their approach based on this. So, for example, rather than constantly pushing back to government saying, tell us what you know, they're now approaching the government and saying, this is our interpretation of the situation. Are we wrong? So there seems to be that shift in dynamics there. And at the same time, these local responders seem to be utilising their regional connections with other responders to discuss lessons and ideas for moving forward. So whilst there seems to be limited information flow coming downwards, they are increasing their level of information by increasing their communication locally. But on the other hand, I think in terms of within organisations, based on my conversations, again, I think I'm definitely seeing evidence that there is listening that's taking place within organisations. So I've been speaking to one responder from the police, and he said that as a manager, he is actively listening to his workforce, and his workforce are telling him that we're tired, we need a break, we've not had a day off in months. And he said that as managers, they're responding to this and they're increasing the number of staff that can take leave at any one time. And he said that firstly, this was to allow his staff to take a break and get their energy back ready for even when a second wave comes or whatever comes next, but also to show staff that as managers, they are listening to them and they're not just considering staff needs, but they are actively trying to communicate and demonstrate that they are aware of that and they are doing something about it. And I think that it's really important to remember that welfare side of things and the psychological impact that working at 100% effort for so long can have. And I think it's really important that staff are being shown to be listened to so they maintain their motivation and their commitment. And I definitely think that within organisations, based on my conversations, I am seeing evidence of this.
That's really interesting, because one of the questions I was seeking to ask later on was about fatigue and how everyone's going to be completely exhausted. And it's hard not to be overwhelmed, because everyone is living through this simultaneously while responding and planning and working really hard and doing all this extra work. So we will address that in a moment. I'll just ask you for your thoughts on this previous question, David.
Okay, thank you. I think listening is one of those really interesting skills that we all assume we have, but actually it's very difficult to quantify. So I think it's very contextualized to say, are we listening well? I think listening is sometimes hearing what's said. To me, it's also more important what's not said sometimes and how that shapes things. And it is, I think, a rare attribute. We often hear what's said, but accompanying that, organizational constraints often prevent that being acted upon. And actually, from the human experience, that can make things worse, to feel you've been given a voice and then it's effectively ignored. And so I think, again, when we look at the structures around some of this, there could be much better at listening. And I think when we work in a profession, it becomes very technical, it becomes very competency based. We generally enjoy what we do, we have an enthusiasm for it. It's very difficult to step outside of that and see the same event through the lens of somebody who wasn't expecting it to happen to them that day, who foresees the consequences for them at that moment. And that can be very different day to day, depending on what's else happening in their life. So I think it's something that's quite hard and is very, let's say, particular. But if we're going to be better at listening, and we might absolutely should be, I think we have to have the corresponding ability to empower. And I suppose one of the last events, as we were doing the customer experience work in the fire service, is a good example where we had a family that had been made homeless about 8 or 9 o'clock on a Sunday evening by the fire. And the advice was grab a train and go 2 hours to stay with family. They've had a really distressing day. The officer there made a personal decision to pay for a hotel for that family down the road to save them all that travel. Fortunately, that decision was backed by the chief. It was not in our process to authorise that. He did risk losing all the money, but he'd heard what the family had said, which was, we've had a really bad day. We don't need a train journey. And I think it's that ability to listen at a human level that's really important, but to empower that through there. And I think also the other part of listening is acceptance. We saw a lot of criticism of people supposedly panic buying in the early stages of the pandemic. I challenged that in an article. It's not panic buying. It's at a time we feel threatened by something unknown of an uncertain period. We regress back to our family unit or the smallest unit we can cope with. To have a ready supply of food for them is not panic buying. It's a sensible response to changing conditions. So I think we can listen, but listening alone is not enough. We have to put in place the process. We also have to put in place some of the human skills behind that to make sure that we're effective. Otherwise, it just builds up frustration on the part of those that are trying to tell us something.
I think that's an excellent point. And actually, there's a really, I'm sure everyone involved in this will have seen the comment, you know, different groups are impacted differently and a one-size response doesn't fit all. That applies to listening as well, and everyone's experience. And it's what you were saying, David, earlier about, you know, the only person who experiences that one experience is the person who's been through the whole event, and everyone interprets it differently, and they will have different experiences. And it was refreshing to see that that was a lot was made of that in terms of the select committee hearings as well, so forth, about that particular point. Now we are blasting through this hour, so I'm going to ask, I mean, we have a lot of questions to get through, and I want to make sure that the audience, you know, some of the questions that were pre-posed are also included. So I wondered if we could all briefly touch on the fatigue and how we get how it's that difference between, again, everyone's experiences, isn't it? The people who've worked through, who have been completely not overwhelmed, because that implies negativity, but you know, how do we work with those? And I won't address this question to you, Louise, because I think you covered it very well. But Jacqui, if you could give us your perspective from the emergency planning side. How can we address this fatigue as further crises are likely to occur soon?
I think that's a huge challenge, partly because I think that all of our organisations are much leaner than they were. There's more expectation on all of us to deliver, and comes with that is that sense of responsibility and accountability for the job that you do. And I know our Resilience magazine has just come out, which is our member organisation, and one of the things in my intro that I have said in there is that one day last week I woke and I just hit the brick wall, and I didn't know why. And there is something about us accepting that we need to have the rest. I'm very good at giving advice. I'm not really good at taking it. And if my husband was here, he would tell you that. But it is that bit about how do we do this differently, because many of us are doing the same things, and a lot of the same things are being repeated. And because of our structure, so whether you work in local government or whatever, a lot of the same things are being done. And I think we do need to think differently about how we can shape that as we go forwards, because we will be dealing with lots of different things as we come into the winter, which we would normally be dealing with, along with the day business that all of our organisations will work to. I think mental health and well-being is extremely important. Recognising that in yourself when you need to take a break and you need to ask for help, I think is not always easy, because it is that sense of responsibility. We've been having resilience huddles every week for all of our members, and we've had a number of sessions and speakers on well-being and the psychology side of well-being, and how do you keep well and how do you keep your brain functioning. And I think without exception, every single person that's been on those huddles has said, do you know what, most of us have worked 5 or 6 months without a break. And that's not acceptable, but that's just the job. It's a bit like the NHS. Everybody's pulling out the stops to do what they need to do in terms of dealing with COVID. But it is that bit about recognising that that's not sustainable. And we need to stay well to be able to do the jobs that we need to do to keep things on the level that we need to. So I don't think there's an easy answer, but I think we absolutely need to be building in all of our organisations, the well-being, making sure your staff are okay. I talk to my staff every day. How are you? What are you doing? What are the issues? What are the challenges? Even just that very quick 10, 15 minutes every day where people feel you actually care as well. But also having the courage to be able to take the step back when you have to. And that's not easy. coming from me.
I think everyone's experiencing that. David, I'm not sure if you had anything you wanted to add to that. Any thoughts on this?
I think just very quickly that I sense that we need to, I think command and control approaches like we're seeing here, where there's a lot of service and institutional activity, are very hard to maintain over long periods. And it's not surprising exhaustion's setting in. But I think there is a solution insofar as the public have a tremendous capacity and willingness to help. There seems to be an institutional block in that we don't regard them as capable, when in truth the evidence suggests very strongly that they are. And I think if you look recently, the NHS volunteers, they get to 750,000 people willing to help, and community schemes springing up all over this. People want to be involved, and I think it's that you can do things to people and wonder why they're not always pleased or responsive, or we can engage them and recognise we are in this together, but that looks different to doing things to them and expecting them to be grateful. And it does have benefits back to us of we become conductors and supporters and blockage clearers rather than having to do everything on their behalf. And I think I know again we had a fire before I left, and just by chance the PR went out, rather than saying about how hard we was working, how difficult the job was, all about the response. It said we've got 60 people that are homeless tonight, and as I say, it was just a quirk, but we spoke about the people affected. We had the local vet say, if any of them got pets, I'll put them up tonight. The village shop said, I'll open up all through the night. The community opened up because it heard a message saying, this is what we need help with, rather than we're working hard. So I think some mindset change and some different messaging. There is a tremendous untapped capacity in the community, and that I'm sure they'd love to help and be very capable at helping.
I think that's been really widely demonstrated, not only in this last crisis, but in any sort of large emergency. And that I know from CRJ, we've published quite a few articles on this, and how to harness that amazing capacity of people who want to pull together and want to help. And sometimes there's been, I'm not necessarily saying in the UK, but sometimes there's a natural suspicion between responding agencies and members of the public and so forth. But the whole zero responders concept and so on is something that I think, as you say, it's a massively untapped resource that could really change things. We are really running out of time because I know everyone's got to their summaries, and I'm so sorry because there were so many excellent questions. We're going to move from that sort of looking inward slightly and widen it out. And I'd like to ask each member of the panel, just as the final question, and it's a difficult one, sorry, what are the panel's views on why the findings of the 2019 Global Health Security Index for Pandemic Preparedness have so clearly differed from the reality of COVID across different nations, but particularly the UK? What can you identify as maybe the 2-3 main points that have just changed this from us feeling we're prepared, it's all in hand, to going to the situation where we are today, or where we were even a month ago, and the horror of that? And I'm going to drop this one on Louise first, sorry.
I think on this question, I don't really have a huge amount that I think I can add on this one, but I'm aware that this is such a uniquely large and complex situation that I think very few countries, if any, were really prepared for. So I think certainly based on this kind of research, I know a lot of other stuff that is going on, a lot of lessons will be identified and subsequently learned from that will inform any future pandemics or incidents of this scale. And I know that based on my conversations with people, they were saying that they had, a lovely pandemic plan that they had, that they were going to follow, but then on day one of this, it was just so unique and so different that plan kind of to an extent went out the window, and they had to rebuild everything because it was just something that there were so many unique factors to this. And as I mentioned, that there's going to be a lot of lessons that will be identified and learned, which is something which in my research that I'm doing now is I really hope to draw out those lessons and identify as many as possible, so that going into the future, if anything of a similar scale was to occur again, that there'd be improved effectiveness, hopefully, of any future multi-agency responses with those lessons that have been identified and learned.
You make a good point about how plans would change as soon as they were done, and that's something that echoes Patrick Lagadec's rapid reflection forces, where he says stop training and trying to write plans for every eventuality, train people to think on their feet with autonomy and empower them and give them the institutional support that they need to make those decisions on the fly, as it were. Jacqui, can I ask you for your views on this?
I think sometimes it's too hard, to be honest, and to think about, actually, we have reports on a number of different things, not just this one, and we have identified a number of different gaps over the years, and yet we don't apply the learning, because every time we do another debrief or another report, the same issues come out. And you have to ask, why is that happening? Because that's a significant failure at all levels in terms of what we're looking at. I think the other thing for me on all of this is, I think Louise's point about the plans, all of our plans, and again, if you're talking about how you write a plan, what it's there for, and plans are one part of our preparation. And it should be around our ability to adapt and be flexible based on the principles of everything that we do, to be able to say, okay, that might not work for that, but actually the framework that we have will work, and some of the other aspects that we need to bring into this. So I do think that there are a number of elements right across the board that are challenging. I think the biggest one, saying that we were preparing for an influenza and hadn't thought about anything else, is probably not quite correct, although influenza had been the main one. COVID-19 coronaviruses are not new. There are lots of research out there on coronaviruses. I want to say corona, I was going to say beer. Coronaviruses that actually give us a lot of information about how they react, how they impact, what happens. And yet we hadn't really thought that through from a public health point of view and looked at the impact and consequences. Whatever is happening with the pandemic, I think if people are honest, and I've been very honest about this, we had done a lot of planning, and obviously my accent, you'll pick up, I'm Scottish. We had done a lot of planning at a Scottish level across all elements of pandemic, from economic, business continuity, recovery, people issues, humanitarian issues, health issues, all of those things, and looked at the interdependencies and had an exercise not that long ago. If I'm honest, did that really, really go into the nitty gritty of actually where we thought we would be? And if we'd given ourselves the scenario of lockdown, everything coming to a halt, schools being out, the economic impact, the businesses, the furlough, which nobody'd heard of, would we have kind of went, oh, that's really not where we would be? And I think with all things like this, we do train, we do exercise, but actually, do we ask the right questions to get the right outcome?
Brings us back to listening as well, doesn't it?
Yeah.
David, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think you can't get that many countries get it wrong without asking some quite fundamental questions as to why. And I think it comes back to that. Do we try and repair what's there, or should we really be looking for very different ways? I sense that we try and oversimplify. This is a really complex issue. There are multiple things that do happen, could happen, things we're aware of, things we haven't taken account of. And I think, again, we see it very often that we like certainty, we like data, we like figures that tell us this will happen. You cannot reduce that down, I think, to Jacqui's point, to a formulaic process that will get us through everything. We can have principles, we can have people that are adaptable. We have to get that human connection so that it doesn't become one organisation trying to assert itself over another. We have to, from my perspective, start with understanding customer needs. What do the public want? As you say, they've been faced with a whole lot of new terms, furlough and things to come to use. But I do sense from that report that it's given a strong signal that we've really got to not just tweak around the edges, but ask some deep questions. I can't suggest I've got the answer to it. I'd have one perspective. There are many more that would be needed, but to repair what's there suggests maybe that we're missing something completely. But it also depends, what do we expect the outcome to be? And I think New Zealand have done some fantastic work, but recently they had the quarantine failure that caused the uproar and the health minister lost his job. And I think the Prime Minister was making a statement that this should never have happened. I think, of course it would. If you look at any distribution curve, most people go to work and repeat the process. But the expectation from the start was fundamentally wrong to say that a human-oriented process would never fail. We bring to work all sorts of different things. There are different factors at work. Of course it would fail. So I think from the design point, some of these things, it's built in at the wrong stage. The design allowed false expectations right the way through, and actually then the safeguards aren't put in. So yeah, I think it's, as I say, it's something we couldn't answer today, but it does, I feel, suggest something that needs quite a real consideration around.
Thank you very much. Well, we're nearing the end of our allocated hour, and I just wondered, we've obviously just teased a few tiny strands out of this massive tangle that we're trying to unpick. But if you could each give me your most salient thoughts on what we've discussed and what you want to leave us with thinking. And if I could start with you, Louise, again, please.
So in kind of a summary, I think that what the response to COVID has shown from kind of the operational point of view, where I'm coming from, is the need and the importance of multi-agency working and how effective it can be. And this has been echoed by a number of people that I've spoken to. And when I asked in my very first couple of interviews what the key strengths of the response has been, so far nearly everybody responded. It's how well everyone has come together and how pre-existing relationships have really strengthened the response, particularly in those early days. So I think moving forward now, past COVID and into the future, I think Jacqui mentioned this earlier, I think now is the perfect time to take this further and really develop and embed this multi-agency working. I think because everyone now has experienced firsthand just how valuable effective multi-agency working can be. And I think in addition to this, I think COVID has demonstrated new and innovative ways of multi-agency working. And I think the best example that I can give here is of the pandemic multi-agency response teams, which was a new idea formulated specifically for COVID, comprised of a team of firefighters, police, and a clinician in some areas, and they attended community deaths. And in my interviews, I've also been speaking to responders who are directly involved in these teams, and I'm currently working on drawing out any lessons that can be identified from this as well, so that they can be fed into the successful management or development of these or similar teams in the future. And whilst I'm still kind of in the early stages of compiling these results and drawing out any lessons, the feedback so far from the people that are involved in these teams has been extremely positive. And I think there's huge potential for the future for using these teams as a really key example of an effective way to get agencies working together collaboratively from that operational point of view. And this is what I hope to draw out in the later stages of my research, where I'll be taking kind of everything that we've learned about multi-agency working and using this to develop theory-based recommendations for improving the effectiveness of multi-agency response in the future. And one final thing as well, just before I wrap it up, is I just want to express my sincere thanks to every single person who's worked with me over the past couple of months and given me your time through the multiple interviews and discussions that we've had. It's been so invaluable to ensure that this research can be as timely and as impactful as it possibly can be. And a final thank you to Emily and the others that are involved in organising this webinar. I think it's been a really, really interesting and useful discussion.
Thank you very much, Louise. And I can't wait to read the rest of the research as well. I think there's some really interesting things that will come out of that. Jacqui, can I ask you to go next, please?
I think what's been said highlights the complexities of what we're dealing with. Not just from a pandemic point of view, but the complexities of the structures, what we have in place, and the gaps that are so evidently there. I also think we're doing ourselves a bit of a disservice, because I actually think we've done some great work, and particularly at local level, there has been some really great delivery, and we really can't lose sight of that. I think the one thing for me is about the role of emergency management in all of this. and the pivotal role that it plays in terms of the knowledge, expertise and uniqueness of that role in the wide breadth of sector. And I'll use an analogy. To me, an emergency manager is about somebody who does what they need to do and is match fit. And I always use an analogy, and hopefully you've not heard me say this before, but Andy Murray, as the tennis player, he trains every day. He has great daily habits. He has a schedule. He has a diet. He's the best he can be. His CPD to keep him match fit, to do the best that he does, is all about winning and making sure that he is the best he can be. For me, that's what the emergency manager is. And the emergency management side should be about making sure we've got the right people in the right roles with the right qualifications, knowledge, experience, that we recognise that and that can support and underpin and influence a different level of voice within the profession.
Couldn't agree more. I have nothing to add to that. David.
I suppose as we're at the end, we should make some big claims, shouldn't we? I think fundamentally we do need to change the relationship between the services and the public, and certainly that's what the research we did with the fire service identified from our perspective and led to the role that of customer experience manager. The way the public experience services is very different to the way that we anticipate them within the service. So you have a professional view which is not matched by the way the public experience. For the public, it's very emotional and it's very contextualized, and it's very difficult to bring that into procedures. And actually, we need both. So we have to deliver the services we deliver, but we have to deliver in a way that provide dignity and humanity, and actually get the best possible outcome for people, not just at the time, but in the longer term. So trying to get people back to pre-event condition or even empower them. And I do think when we looked at it across the services, the health are moving that way with public involvement, and certainly high-level statements about public engagement and co-creation. The police are moving that direction with some work around sort of victim support. Some of the other emergency services, it's not featuring. So again, you get this disparate service, because whilst people are moving towards that, they're all doing it in different ways at different speeds. And so I think we talk about the emergency services as a collective. They are all individual. Even within services, every local service varies, and they're not a harmonious collective. And so I think, as I've said in our report, we have to really, I think, improve some of the structures around the planning. You can't just bring people together and expect good things to happen. You get well-meaning and, to an extent, self-assessment. And the assessment of how well we do our job technically is one thing. The assessment of whether it's relevant and appropriate is very different from the members of the public. And I think we need to bring those better together. And certainly the difficulty we found is that end-to-end service design, that you can't just do your bit and assume that what other people do, because in the assumptions, there are errors that actually can do harm and mean that the person that experiences it is confused and has more effort at a distressing time than they should. So I think user-centered design principles, innovation, empowering the public, empowering people within the services to have freedom to do the right thing, and to bring together multiple perspectives, not just the same crowd, are some of the things that I would advocate for the future.
Thank you very, very much indeed. As I said before, I really wish we had more time to discuss this, because I think we've just scratched the surface. Some of the things I've taken away from this is exploring the new ways of multi-agency working. And now is definitely the time to seize the moment, even though we must also be cognizant of the fatigue and the tiredness and all the extra work that's going on. It is an important time to start looking forward and seeing how we can improve. The public is absolutely essential, and public engagement and treating public with respect and listening to everybody and the views from everyone and bringing in different voices, I think, is also really important. And it's not just dialogue, it's also the listening. So it only remains for me, it's 15:59, so we're bang on time, to say thank you very, very much to all of our panelists for taking part. Thank you to everybody who joined us. And also thanks to IDME, ES and the World Humanitarian Forum for hosting this event. Bye.